The last thing I remember, before the ambulance doors slammed shut, was the sound of my sister laughing. Not nervous laughter, not the kind people make when they don't know what else to do. Real laughter, the kind that comes from deep in the chest when someone truly finds something funny. I was sitting on the frozen concrete of my mother's front porch, my legs too numb to stand, my fingers stiff like pieces of wood. Snow had blown sideways across the yard, dusting the welcome mat beside me. The wind cut straight through my thin cardigan, and every breath burned my lungs like swallowing broken glass. Through the kitchen window, I could see them. My mother and my sister. They were sitting at the table with 2 big mugs of hot chocolate steam curling into the yellow kitchen light. And Linda, my sister, was holding up her phone, taking pictures of me. The paramedics later told me my core temperature had dropped to 93 degrees. Hypothermia. Another hour, they said, and I might not have made it. But the part that changed everything wasn't the cold. It was the photos. Because when the ER doctor saw what my family had posted in their group chat while I was freezing outside, she called the police. My name is Evelyn Parker, and I was 62 years old the night my own family locked me outside in the cold. If you had met me before that winter, you probably would have called me dependable. The kind of woman who shows up early to church dinners and stays late washing dishes. The kind who remembers birthdays, brings soup when someone's sick, and never lets a neighbor shovel their driveway alone. I'd spent most of my life that way. Helping. Especially when it came to my family. My father had died 8 years earlier, after a long stretch of heart trouble. During those final years, I was the one who drove him to appointments, managed his medications, and sat beside his recliner, watching old westerns when the nights got long. My younger sister Linda lived only 10 minutes away, but somehow she was always too busy. Busy meant different things for Linda. Hair appointments, bingo nights, weekend trips with friends. Still, I never complained. That's just how families worked, I told myself. Someone had to be the responsible one. After Dad passed, my mother Dorothy stayed in the same ranch house they'd bought back in the 70s. It was nothing fancy, 3 bedrooms, brick exterior, creaky hardwood floors, but it held 50 years of memories. And Mom didn't want to leave it. That winter, I had moved in temporarily after knee surgery. My doctor had advised me not to climb the stairs in my apartment building for a few weeks, and Mom said it would make things easier for everyone. Looking back, I should have known better. Linda had always been Mom's favorite. That wasn't bitterness talking, it was simply a fact. Linda was charming, pretty, quick with jokes. I was the serious one, reliable, the kind of daughter people lean on. That Friday night started with something small. It was late January, and the cold had settled over our Ohio town like a heavy lid. The local news kept warning people to stay inside unless absolutely necessary. Temperatures were dipping into the single digits, with wind chill pushing things even lower. Inside the house, Mom and Linda sat at the kitchen table arguing about money. Specifically my money. I had been contributing to groceries and utilities while staying there, but somehow the conversation turned into accusations that I wasn't doing enough. Linda leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "You've been here almost a month, Ev," she said. "Mom shouldn't have to carry you." Carry me. I had paid the heating bill 3 weeks earlier, but I stayed calm. "I'm recovering from surgery," I said quietly. "You know that." Mom stirred her cocoa without looking at me. "Well," she said, "Linda works hard too." Something in my chest tightened. That familiar feeling. The one where the ground shifts and you realize the conversation isn't really about facts. It's about sides. And Mom had already chosen hers. I pushed my chair back slowly. "I'm just going to get some air," I said. Linda rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, don't start the drama." I grabbed my cardigan from the back of the chair and stepped outside onto the porch. The cold hit me like a slap. It was sharper than I expected, but I figured I'd only be out there a minute, just long enough to cool down and collect myself. I closed the door behind me. Then I heard the lock click. At first I thought it was automatic. Some houses do that. I turned the knob. Locked. I knocked gently. Mom! No answer. I knocked again louder. Linda. Through the window, I could see them still sitting at the table, talking, laughing. Finally, Linda looked over toward the door. Instead of getting up, she raised her phone. The flash popped. A photo. I frowned, confused. What are you doing? I said through the glass. Mom didn't even look my way. Linda waved. Then she lifted her mug and took a slow sip of hot chocolate. Another flash. Another photo. I knocked harder now. Okay, that's not funny, I said. The wind pushed against my back. Snowflakes stung my face. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 20. My fingers started to ache. I pounded on the door. Let me in. Inside, Linda leaned over and showed Mom something on her phone. They both laughed. Another picture. By the time an hour passed, the cold had sunk deep into my bones. My legs trembled. My thoughts slowed. I sat down on the porch step because standing felt impossible. That's when Mr. Whitaker across the street saw me. He was 80 if he was a day, but he still took his trash cans out every Friday night. Later he told police he thought something looked wrong. A grown woman sitting outside in the snow without a coat. He waved at me. I tried to wave back. My arm barely moved. The next thing I remember is flashing red lights and the sound of someone shouting. And Linda's voice from the doorway saying, "Oh my God, she's actually sick." Part 1. The night. Everything changed. Word count 1028. Continue. The first clear sound I heard in the ambulance was someone saying my name. Evelyn. Evelyn, stay with us. My eyes opened halfway, but everything looked foggy, like the world had been covered in frost. I felt hands moving quickly, tightening straps, wrapping warm blankets around me, placing something soft over my face. Oxygen's on another voice said, the inside of the ambulance smelled like antiseptic and rubber. Red lights flashed through the back windows, reflecting off metal cabinets and plastic equipment. My teeth were chattering so violently I could barely speak. Long, I managed. The paramedic leaned close to me. He was a middle-aged man with gray in his beard and the calm voice of someone who had seen a lot of bad nights. "You were outside too long, ma'am," he said gently. "We've got you now." I tried to move my hands, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. Then I heard another voice behind him. What was she doing outside? A pause. "Neighbor says she was locked out." The words floated through the fog in my head like slow-moving clouds. Locked out. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell them it was some kind of misunderstanding. My family wouldn't really leave me outside like that. But even in my half-frozen state, the image came back clear as glass. Linda's phone flash. Mom sipping hot chocolate. The laughter. My chest tightened. The paramedic checked a thermometer probe attached near my ear. "Core temp 93, he said. A low whistle came from the other paramedic. Hypothermia. I didn't remember much after that. Just the ride, the siren fading in and out like a distant storm, and the feeling of warmth slowly creeping back into my body through heated blankets. When we reached the hospital, everything became brighter. Too bright. Fluorescent lights. Voices. Footsteps moving quickly across polished floors. Someone rolled my stretcher through swinging doors. 62-year-old female, the paramedic reported. Cold exposure found outside residence for extended period. How long? A woman asked. Neighbor estimates 2 to 3 hours. That got everyone's attention. I heard the rustle of medical gloves snapping into place. We need warm IV fluids, the woman said. That was Dr. Harris. I didn't know her yet, but her voice carried the kind of authority that quiets a room. Let's get her temperature stabilized first, she continued, slow rewarming. A nurse leaned close to me. You're in the emergency room, Evelyn, she said softly. You're safe. Safe! It had been hours since I felt that word meant anything. Time in the ER moves strangely. You drift in and out of awareness while the world keeps spinning around you. At some point, warm IV fluids started running through my arm. Heated blankets were layered over me like heavy quilts. Someone checked my pulse again and again. Gradually the shaking slowed. Feeling returned to my fingers like tiny needles. Then the doors burst open behind the nurse's station. I didn't have to turn my head to know who it was. Linda's voice carried across the room immediately. Oh my God, where is she? My mother's softer voice followed. We're here about Evelyn Parker. The nurse glanced toward them but didn't move. Dr. Harris stepped forward. You'll need to wait just a moment, she said calmly. Linda pushed past the counter anyway. There she is, she said, pointing. Mom hurried beside her. When I turned my head, their faces looked completely different than they had through the kitchen window earlier. Concerned, wide-eyed, almost theatrical. Oh, Evelyn, Mom said, placing a hand to her chest. What happened? I stared at her. My voice came out weak. You locked the door, Linda scoffed. That's ridiculous. She folded her arms. You stormed outside and refused to come in. Dr. Harris's eyes moved slowly between the three of us. And you didn't call for help, she asked. Linda shrugged. We thought she was being dramatic. I felt something inside my chest collapse. Not because of what Linda said, but because of how easily she said it. As if the last 3 hours had been a minor inconvenience. One of the nurses cleared her throat. Doctor? She said quietly, holding a phone. Dr. Harris stepped closer. What is it? The nurse turned the screen toward her. I think you should see this. Dr. Harris took the phone. For a moment she simply stared. Then her expression changed. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more precise. Where did this come from? She asked. Group chat, the nurse replied. Linda shifted her weight. What's going on? Dr. Harris lifted the phone slightly. The screen reflected faintly in her glasses. Even from across the room I could recognize the image. Me, curled on the porch steps. Snow on my shoulders. My face pale and stiff. The timestamp glowed in the corner. 2 hours earlier. Dr. Harris swiped. Another photo. Me pounding weakly on the door. Another swipe. Me sitting on the concrete head, drooping forward. Linda's face went pale. That's private, she said quickly. Those were just jokes. Dr. Harris looked up slowly. Jokes. Linda's voice faltered. Well, I mean, it wasn't like she was actually. Your sister's core temperature was 93 degrees when she arrived here, Dr. Harris said. The entire ER seemed to grow quieter. That is life-threatening hypothermia. Mom's hand trembled slightly. We didn't realize it was that serious. Dr. Harris held the phone up again. These photos were taken over a span of nearly 3 hours. No one spoke. The doctor handed the phone back to the nurse. Then she turned toward the desk. Please contact hospital security, she said. Linda blinked. Why? Dr. Harris met her eyes. Because documenting someone's medical emergency instead of helping them raises serious concerns. Linda's mouth opened, but no words came out. Dr. Harris continued calmly. And because I'll also be contacting the police? I lay there under the blankets, listening to the silence that followed. For 62 years I had protected my family, excused them, explained their behavior away. But in that quiet emergency room, surrounded by strangers who had no reason to choose sides. The truth had finally stepped into the light. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the only one who could see it. Part 2. The Emergency Room and the First Witnesses. Word count 1024. Continue. I woke up just before dawn to the sound of a blood pressure cuff tightening around my arm. For a second, I didn't know where I was. The room was dim, except for the pale glow from the hallway. There was a plastic pitcher of water on the bedside table, a box of tissues, and one of those brown vinyl chairs hospitals always seem to have, the kind nobody can sit in comfortably for very long. Then I looked down at my hands. My fingertips were red and swollen, not black, thank God, but angry-looking, tender and stiff. My skin hurt, in a way I can only describe as deep. Not a cut, not a bruise. More like my body had been insulted and hadn't decided yet whether to forgive me for letting it happen. The nurse checking my pressure gave me a small smile. "Morning, Evelyn. I'm Carla. How are you feeling?" "Like I got run over," I said. She laughed softly. "That's not unusual." The cuff loosened with a hiss. "You gave us a scare last night." That word again. Us. I wasn't used to being part of an us, unless I was the one taking care of everybody else. Carla adjusted the blanket over my legs. "Dr. Harris will be back in a little while. You've got a social worker coming too." I looked at her. A social worker. She nodded, and her expression changed just enough for me to understand that my case had become something more than a simple hospital stay. "It's routine," she said kindly, "when there are concerns about neglect or safety." Neglect! Safety. Those were words people used for old folks abandoned in bad nursing homes, or little kids found hungry in dirty apartments. Not women like me. Women who had worked 40 years, paid taxes, sat through PTA meetings, cared for dying parents, and still sent Christmas cards every year, even when their hands ached from arthritis. I stared up at the ceiling after Carla left, and let the words roll through my mind. Neglect. Safety. The truth was, I had spent so many years making excuses for my mother and sister that I no longer knew what counted as normal. That sounds foolish when I say it plainly, but I think a lot of people my age will understand what I mean. Families form around certain rules, spoken and unspoken. In ours, Linda was precious fragile and full of promise no matter what she did. My mother was to be obeyed, soothed, and never embarrassed in public. And I was the steady one, the one who absorbed things, the one who endured. When Dr. Harris came in, she didn't rush. She pulled that brown chair closer to the bed and sat down like she intended to tell me the truth, not some polished hospital version of it. "How are you feeling this morning?" she asked. "Sore? Tired?" That makes sense. She opened the chart in her hands. "Your temperature's normal now. Your heart looks fine. We want to keep watching your circulation, especially in your fingers and toes. But right now, I'm encouraged." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then she folded the chart closed. "Police did come by last night," she said. "I told them I'd prefer they wait until you were more alert before speaking with you in any detail. They may come back later this morning if you're up for it." I nodded, then looked away. Dr. Harris watched me carefully. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer as honestly as you can. Has anything like this happened before?" I gave the answer I had given my whole life. "No, not like this," which was true in the narrowest sense. No one had ever literally locked me outside in freezing weather before. But the longer I sat there, the more that answer bothered me. Dr. Harris must have sensed it because she didn't move on. She just waited. So I tried again. My family. I began then stopped. The words felt heavy, embarrassing, too private. My mother and sister have a way of making everything sound like my fault. Dr. Harris didn't react, didn't frown, didn't pity me. She just listened. It's always been that way, I said. Linda says something cruel, and if I object, I'm too sensitive. My mother overlooks it, or laughs, or tells me I'm making trouble. After a while, you start thinking maybe you really are the problem. Dr. Harris leaned back slightly. That's more common than you might think. I gave a humorless little laugh. Well, that's depressing. It is, she said, but it's also useful to name it. After she left, I lay there thinking about that phrase. Useful to name it. There's power in naming a thing honestly. It pins it down, stops it from slipping around in the dark. When the social worker came in, she introduced herself as Janice Miller, late 50s, sensible haircut, low heels, warm brown eyes. She looked like the sort of woman who brought a casserole when someone died and a notebook when someone lied. She sat where Dr. Harris had sat and crossed one leg neatly over the other. I know this is uncomfortable, she said, but my job is to understand whether what happened to you was a one-time event or part of a pattern. That word landed hard. Pattern. I looked down at my hands again, and suddenly, against my will, old memories began rising one by one. Not dramatic things. That's the trick of family cruelty. It often doesn't look dramatic while it's happening. I remembered being 12 and having the flu so bad I could barely lift my head while Mom insisted I still clear the dinner table because Linda had homework. Linda was in the den watching television. I remembered buying my own prom dress off the clearance rack because Linda needed braces and we can't afford extras for both girls right now, though somehow Linda got a new Easter coat that spring. I remembered being 27 newly divorced, crying quietly at the kitchen sink while Mom told me maybe my husband left because I was hard to live with. I remembered Dad years later asking in a whisper if I could come by after work because he hadn't had his pills on time. Linda was supposed to stop in that afternoon, but she'd gone to the outlet mall with friends. I remembered every holiday where Linda arrived, late empty-handed, then somehow got praised for bringing such energy while I'd cooked the ham, set the table, and paid for half the groceries. Janice let me talk until I ran out of breath. When I did, she asked the gentlest question anyone had asked me in years. Evelyn, when was the last time someone in that house made you feel safe? I opened my mouth and closed it, because the awful truth was I didn't know. Not since my father was alive, maybe. And even then, he'd mostly kept the peace by staying quiet. Janice wrote something down. You are not obligated to return there, she said. It was such a simple sentence, but it cracked something open in me. I had spent weeks telling myself I'd go back once I was discharged, keep my head down, avoid conflict, recover my knee, and then figure out my next step. Like returning to that house was simply what one did. You can say no, Janice continued, to living there, to being alone with them, to contact if you need space. You can say no and still be a decent daughter. That last part was almost more than I could bear, because decency had been the leash they used on me my whole life. Around noon the police came. A male officer in his 40s and a younger woman with a legal pad. They were polite, professional, not dramatic at all, which oddly made the whole thing feel more real. They asked me to describe the evening from the beginning. I told them about the argument, the click of the lock, the photographs, the laughter, Mr. Whitaker spotting me from across the street. Then the younger officer asked, Had your mother or sister ever threatened you before? I hesitated, not in so many words. But I swallowed. They've humiliated me before. They've lied about me, taken money they promised to repay, made me feel crazy for objecting. This was the first time I thought I might die. The officers exchanged a quick glance. The older one said, "Hospital security preserved the images and timestamps. We've also spoken to your neighbor and the paramedics. We'll be following up." After they left my church, friend Marianne arrived carrying a blue knit sweater folded over one arm and the kind of face people get when they've been trying not to cry in the car. Marianne and I had known each other 35 years. We taught vacation Bible school together, back when our hair was still brown and our knees didn't hurt every time rain rolled in. She sat down carefully and took my hand, avoiding the sore fingertips. "Oh, Evelyn," she whispered. "That was all it took. I started crying so hard my chest hurt. Not because of the cold, not even because of my mother. Because somebody decent had finally seen me. When I'd calmed down, I told her the broad version. Not every detail, just enough. Marianne listened, then said the one sentence that would stay with me long after the IV came out, and the bruises faded. Being related to someone does not give them the right to endanger you. I looked at her through blurry eyes. She squeezed my hand. "That's not family trouble," she said. "That's abuse." And once she said it plain and unadorned, I couldn't unhear it. For the first time in my life, I began to imagine something I had never allowed myself before. A life that did not revolve around earning love from people who enjoyed withholding it. A life where peace wasn't something I begged for. A life where I did not go back. At some point that afternoon, snow began falling again outside my hospital window, soft and steady over the parking lot. I watched it gather on the tops of parked cars and thought about how close I had come to vanishing into that same white silence. And I understood, maybe for the first time, that surviving a thing means more than living through it. Sometimes it means refusing to step back into the place that nearly killed you. Part 3. Old wounds come to light. Word count 1042. Continue. By the third day, the story had started moving through town. Not racing exactly. Ours wasn't the kind of Ohio town where scandal traveled like wildfire. It moved more like winter weather, quietly from porch to porch, over phone calls after supper, in conversations at the pharmacy counter, and the church fellowship hall. A look here, a lowered voice there. Concern dressed up as curiosity. I knew it was happening before anyone told me. There's a certain way nurses speak when they've recognized your name from somewhere else. A little softer, a little more careful, not cruel, not nosy, just aware. Marianne drove over after lunch with a fresh cardigan, my reading glasses, and a small zippered bag of toiletries she'd picked up from the drugstore. She also brought what she called the neighborhood report. She sat down in that same brown chair and set her purse at her feet. "Well," she said with a tired exhale, "your sister's trying to get ahead of it." I gave a dry laugh. "Of course she is." Marianne nodded. "She's telling people you had some kind of episode. Says you stormed outside, refused help, and now you're trying to punish them because you're embarrassed." That stung, though it shouldn't have surprised me. Linda had always been quickest on her feet when it came to building a version of events that made her look innocent. She could turn a wasp nest into a flower arrangement if it saved her reputation. "And Mom?" I asked. Marianne's mouth tightened. "She's going with the confused old lady routine, telling people she didn't understand what was happening." I looked down at the hospital blanket over my knees. The thing about lies in small towns is that they depend on old habits. People had seen me for years as the serious one, the dutiful daughter, the woman who kept family matters private no matter what. Linda was the more social one. Quick smile, easy laugh, knew everybody's grandkids' names. My mother, meanwhile, had spent decades polishing her image as the respectable widow who kept a tidy house and sent handwritten thank you notes. The story would work on some people, at least for a little while. What are you hearing from the others? I asked. Marianne sat back. More than they expected, less than they hoped. That sounded like her. She told me Mr. Whitaker had already given a statement and was not backing down. Apparently, he'd said to more than one person that nobody sits outside in January for 3 hours in house slippers unless something's badly wrong. One of Linda's own church friends had heard about the photos and was horrified. Another woman in that group, someone Linda played cards with once a month, had apparently shown screenshots to her husband, who told her flat out, "That's not a joke. That's evidence." That word settled over me. Evidence. All my life I had lived inside feelings. Doubt, guilt, obligation, the shifting weather of family moods. Now there was evidence. Timestamps, witnesses, records. Something sturdier than my own memory. Late that afternoon, Janice the social worker came back with a folder tucked under her arm. "I've spoken with Adult Protective Services," she said, "and your doctor signed off on discharge for tomorrow as long as you have somewhere safe to go." I nodded. I'm not going back there. The relief on her face was immediate and unguarded. "Good," she said. That one word almost made me cry. We went over practical things, medications, follow-up care, warm clothing where I might stay. Marianne had already offered her guest room, a little back bedroom with quilt wallpaper and too many decorative pillows, and Janice said that would be fine as a temporary arrangement. Then Janice asked, "Have you contributed financially to your mother's household while you've been staying there?" I gave a short laugh. "Yes." "How much?" I told her what I'd paid toward groceries, utilities, and the heating bill. Then I mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I had also written checks over the past 2 years for home repairs my mother said she couldn't manage alone, a water heater, some roof work, half the deductible after a minor plumbing issue in the kitchen. "Do you have records?" Janice asked. "I think so." She opened the folder and pulled out a yellow pad. "Start making a list." That night, lying in my hospital bed, while the hallway lights glowed under the door, I did exactly that. And once I started, I couldn't stop. Not just the recent checks, older things too. The money I'd loaned to Linda when her car transmission went out. The cash I'd handed my mother for property taxes one tight winter after Dad died. The times I paid for holiday groceries because we'll settle up later. The insurance premium Linda had promised to cover and never did. The furniture my mother said she wanted me to inherit someday, though lately she'd begun saying Linda needed it more. By midnight, I wasn't just making a list. I was drawing a map of my own foolishness. The next morning, after discharge papers and a careful lecture about watching my circulation, Marianne drove me to her house. It was a simple brick Cape Cod at the end of a quiet street, neat as a pin with a bird feeder in the back and a plastic Virgin Mary tucked beside the hydrangeas. The guest room smelled faintly like cedar and hand lotion. It felt more peaceful than my mother's house had in years. I slept for 4 straight hours. When I woke up, there was a voicemail on Marianne's landline from an attorney whose name Janice had given me. A local elder law and family attorney. Practical, no nonsense. I met him 2 days later. His office sat above a dentist's office on Main Street, with framed photos of covered bridges and legal certificates hung crookedly but respectfully. His name was Thomas Becker, and he looked exactly like an attorney in a town like ours ought to look: silver hair, navy suit, reading glasses, low on his nose, tie slightly askew by late afternoon. He listened without interrupting while I explained the family background, the money, the house, the hospital, the photos. When I finished, he folded his hands over a legal pad. "Mrs. Parker, he said you have two separate matters here. One is criminal, and the state will handle that. The other is civil and personal. Your money, your boundaries, your future. Those are things we can address." His calmness steadied me. "I don't want to ruin my mother," I said automatically. The words came out before I had time to think. Mr. Becker gave me a long look. "With respect," he said, "your mother and sister appear to have taken some significant steps in that direction themselves." I sat very still. He continued, "What you're doing now is not revenge in the cartoon sense. It's documentation, clarity, protection. Protection. Another new word for me. I left his office with copies of paperwork, a list of documents to gather, and the faint, strange feeling that my life might not be over just because my family had behaved as though it belonged to them. A few days later, one of Linda's friends did something I never would have expected. She came to see me. Her name was Denise. I knew her by face more than anything else from church potlucks and one or two summer cookouts years back. She stood in Marianne's front hallway, twisting her gloves in her hands, looking so uncomfortable I almost felt sorry for her. I shouldn't have laughed at the first picture she said, before she'd even sat down. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then she reached into her purse and handed me printed screenshots. The group chat. Photo after photo. Linda's captions underneath. "Drama queen on ice. She'll come in when she's ready." One final image of me slumped sideways near the porch railing. My mother had replied with a laughing face emoji. I stared down at the pages until the words blurred. Denise's voice trembled. "I sent these to the detective too. I just thought you should know." When she left, I sat at Marianne's kitchen table with the paper spread out in front of me like something recovered from a crash. And that was the moment it fully shifted. Not because I learned anything new, but because I finally stopped protecting them from the shame of what they had done. I didn't call people. I didn't campaign. I didn't tell my side of town over coffee. I simply stopped lying for them. And once I did, the truth began doing its own work. Part 4. The truth spreads through the community word. Count 1036. Continue. Spring arrived slowly that year. Not with a burst of sunshine and blooming trees, the way it sometimes does, but inch by inch. First the snowbanks melted into gray piles along the curbs. Then the sidewalks cleared. Then one afternoon, in late March, I noticed a few stubborn crocuses pushing through the damp soil beside Marianne's front steps. By then, I had been living in her guest room nearly 7 weeks. Long enough for the routine of it to feel natural. Marianne and I drank coffee together every morning at her kitchen table, the radio humming softly with the local news station. She went off to her volunteer shifts at the church office a few mornings a week. I spent my days doing physical therapy exercises for my knee, walking short laps around the neighborhood when the weather cooperated, and sorting through the paperwork Mr. Becker had asked me to gather. There was more of it than I expected. Receipts, canceled checks, handwritten notes from my mother about home repairs. She said she couldn't afford the little scraps of proof that I had been quietly supporting that household far longer than anyone acknowledged. Every time I thought I'd reached the end, another memory surfaced. Another envelope, another check stub. At first it made me angry. Then it made me tired. But gradually something else replaced both feelings. Clarity. For 62 years, I had told myself a story about my family, that loyalty meant endurance, that love required patience, that if I just tried harder, things would eventually balance out. Looking at those stacks of paper, I finally saw the pattern plainly. Things had been balanced all right, just not in my favor. The legal process moved slower than I expected. Criminal matters always do. The detective handling the case called me twice to clarify details, and Mr. Becker explained that prosecutors needed time to review everything before deciding how to proceed. In the meantime, consequences began arriving in quieter ways. Linda lost her job at the insurance office downtown. Not officially, because of the incident, of course. The company cited restructuring. But word travels quickly in a small workplace, and apparently several clients had raised concerns after hearing what happened. My mother, meanwhile, stopped attending her usual church circle on Wednesdays. At first she told people she had a cold, then a lingering cough. Eventually, she stopped explaining altogether. I heard these things secondhand through Marianne, who tried to soften the news but never hid it. One evening in early April, she came home from choir practice with that thoughtful look she gets when she's deciding how much truth a person is ready to hear. "What is it?" I asked, setting down the dish towel I'd been using to dry plates. She leaned against the counter. "Your sister's been telling people you're trying to ruin them." I sighed. "That's predictable." Marianne nodded slowly. "But the part she's leaving out is the pictures." Of course she was. Without the photographs, the story might sound like a bitter family argument blown out of proportion. With them, it became something else entirely. Evidence. Proof. Reality. About 2 weeks later, I moved into my own place. It wasn't grand by any means. A small one-bedroom apartment in a senior living complex just outside town. The building had wide hallways, an elevator that rattled slightly between floors, and a little community room where residents played cards on Thursday afternoons. But it was clean, warm, quiet. Most importantly, it was mine. The first night there, I sat on the couch with a bowl of soup and listened to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside the parking lot, lights glowed against the dark. No shouting, no tension simmering under the surface, no feeling that every word might spark an argument. Just peace. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd felt that. Mr. Becker continued handling the financial side of things. We weren't trying to take my mother's house or anything dramatic like that. The goal was simpler: document what had happened, clarify ownership questions, and ensure that any money I'd contributed was acknowledged properly. More than once, I caught myself apologizing to him during meetings. "I don't want to make things worse," I'd say. He would always give the same steady reply. "Mrs. Parker, you are not making things worse. You are making them accurate." Accurate. That word began to mean a great deal to me, because for years, accuracy had been the one thing missing from my family's version of events. Around that time, I also started volunteering twice a week at the hospital gift shop. Dr. Harris had suggested it half-jokingly during one of my follow-up appointments. "Consider it exposure therapy," she said. "A chance to replace a bad memory with a better one." The shop was small, but cheerful. Rows of greeting cards, stuffed animals for children recovering from surgery, crossword puzzle books, and little boxes of chocolates. Most of the volunteers were retirees like me, people who enjoyed having somewhere to go and someone to talk to. One afternoon, a nurse recognized my name on the volunteer badge. "You're the lady from the hypothermia case," she said gently. For a moment I felt the old embarrassment rise, but then she added something that surprised me. "I'm glad you made it," she said. "Cases like that don't always end well." That night, I thought about those words while sitting in my apartment with a cup of tea. Cases like that. I realized something important then. The worst thing that happened to me wasn't the cold. It was the years I had spent believing that enduring cruelty was the same thing as being a good person. Letting go of that belief felt like loosening a knot I'd been carrying in my chest for decades. By early summer, the prosecutor announced formal charges against Linda related to neglect and reckless endangerment. The legal language sounded colder than the story itself, but the meaning was clear enough. Actions have consequences. My mother wasn't charged in the same way. Her age and health complicated things. Instead, Adult Protective Services required certain oversight measures, regular check-ins, financial monitoring, and counseling. I felt strange hearing those outcomes. Part of me expected triumph. Instead, I mostly felt quiet. One afternoon, months after the hospital stay, I walked through a local park where children were feeding ducks near the pond. The air smelled like cut grass and sunlight. I sat on a bench and watched an elderly couple shuffle past, holding hands. It struck me then that revenge, the kind people imagine in dramatic stories, rarely looks like shouting or courtroom speeches. More often it looks like something quieter. A life rebuilt. Peace earned. The simple freedom of waking up in a home where no one is waiting for you to fail. But healing isn't a straight line. Some nights I still dreamed about the porch, the wind, the cold seeping through my bones. And every time I woke up, I reminded myself of the truth I had learned the hard way. Surviving something doesn't mean pretending it never happened. It means building something stronger afterward. Part 5. Evelyn rebuilds while consequences arrive. Word count 1030. Continue. Late in August, I received a phone call I had been expecting for months. But that didn't make it any easier to hear. I had just finished watering the small flower boxes outside my apartment balcony when my phone rang. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the air feels heavy but gentle, and the cicadas buzz lazily in the trees. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered. Hello. The voice on the other end hesitated. Evelyn. It was Linda. For a moment neither of us spoke. I hadn't heard her voice since the hospital. Hi, she said finally. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. What do you want? I asked, not unkindly but plainly. There was a pause. It's Mom, she said. Something in my chest tightened immediately. What about her? She fell yesterday. The words came out in a rush after that. Mom had slipped in the kitchen. Nothing catastrophic, no broken hip, thank God, but enough that the paramedics were called. The hospital kept her overnight for observation. She's home now, Linda said, but things aren't good. I sat down slowly at the small table near the window. How bad? I asked. She's weak, Linda admitted, and honestly she's scared. The irony of that word did not escape me. Scared. For years, my mother had been the one people leaned on for strength, or at least the appearance of it. Hearing that fear had finally reached her felt strange, like discovering the walls of a familiar house had quietly shifted overnight. Linda cleared her throat. She asked about you. I didn't answer immediately. Outside my window, a breeze stirred the leaves of the maple tree in the courtyard. What did you tell her? I asked. The truth, Linda said softly. That surprised me. She said she wanted to see you, Linda continued, if you're willing. The request hung between us like fragile glass. 6 months earlier, I might have rushed over without thinking. That had always been my role, the dependable daughter who appeared when needed. But the woman sitting at that kitchen table that afternoon was not the same one who had once sat freezing on a porch, begging to be let inside. I'll think about it, I said. Linda didn't argue. Okay. Her voice cracked slightly. And Evelyn, I'm sorry. The apology sounded awkward, unfinished, but something about it felt real. We hung up a minute later. That evening, I took a long walk around the apartment complex. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft pink and gold. A few other residents were out strolling the sidewalks, nodding hello as they passed. I thought about everything that had happened since January. The cold, the hospital, the photographs, the months of quiet rebuilding. Forgiveness is a complicated thing. People sometimes talk about it as though it happens all at once, like flipping a light switch. But in my experience, forgiveness grows slowly the way a garden does. You clear away the weeds first, then you wait. And sometimes you decide certain things will never grow again in that soil. The next morning I called Linda back. "I'll come see Mom," I said, "but there are conditions." "I understand," she replied immediately. First I said, "I won't be staying there. Not overnight, not ever again." "That's fair." "Second, if I come over, it's to help arrange proper care for her, not to pretend nothing happened." "I know," Linda said quietly. "And third," I continued, "we speak honestly. No rewriting the story. No pretending I imagined it." There was a long silence. Then she said, "Okay." 2 days later, I walked up the same front path I had walked 1,000 times before. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The porch railing had been repainted. The wind chimes Dad used to hang every spring were gone. For a moment I stood there remembering the cold night, months earlier. Then I knocked. Linda opened the door. She looked older. Not dramatically so, but the kind of older that comes from stress and sleepless nights. The easy confidence she once carried like a favorite jacket seemed to have slipped away. "Hi," she said. "Hi." Neither of us moved for a second. Then she stepped aside. Mom was sitting in her recliner in the living room, wrapped in a pale blue blanket. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Evelyn," she whispered. For a moment I simply stood there studying her face. This was the woman who had raised me, corrected my homework, taught me how to bake cornbread, and comforted me after my first heartbreak. This was also the woman who had laughed while I froze outside her door. Both things were true. I walked over slowly and pulled a chair closer. "How are you feeling?" I asked. She reached for my hand. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice trembling, "about what happened." I waited. Her eyes filled again. "I always expected you to be the strong one," she said, "the one who could handle anything." The words landed softly but heavily. "You expected me to endure it," I replied. She nodded slowly. "I suppose I did." Linda stood near the doorway, listening quietly. For the first time in years, there were no jokes, no deflections, no easy excuses filling the room. Just honesty. "I'm not the same person I was before that night," I told them. Mom squeezed my hand weakly. "I know." Linda stepped forward, then her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was funny at first," she admitted. "I didn't think about what could actually happen." She wiped her eyes. "And once I realized, I didn't know how to stop." No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, I said something that surprised even me. "I forgive you." Linda's head lifted quickly. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences," I added gently. Mom nodded. "I understand." And for the first time in my life, I believed she actually might. We spent the next hour talking about practical things, home health visits, grocery delivery medication schedules. The conversation stayed calm. Careful. Real. When I finally stood to leave, Mom held my hand again. "Thank you for coming," she said. I nodded. But as I walked back down that porch, one thing was clear. Forgiveness had opened a door. Trust, however, would take much longer to rebuild. The next winter arrived quietly. Not the brutal biting kind that had nearly taken my life the year before. Just a steady Ohio, winter gray skies, soft snow, and the familiar rhythm of people bundling up and getting on with their days. By then my life looked very different. I had been living in my little apartment for nearly a year. The place had begun to feel like home, in the way small spaces sometimes do, every chair exactly where you want it, every cupboard holding things you actually use. I had a crocheted throw draped over the back of the couch, a stack of paperback mysteries on the coffee table, and a small radio in the kitchen that played old country songs while I cooked. Simple things, but peaceful. On Tuesday mornings, I volunteered at the hospital gift shop. Thursdays, I joined the card group in the community room downstairs, where half a dozen of us played bridge and argued about whether the coffee machine made anything worth drinking. Life had settled into something calm and steady, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for decades. My relationship with Mom and Linda had changed too. We didn't pretend everything was fine. That would have been dishonest, and honesty had become one of the conditions for staying in each other's lives. Mom now had regular home care visits, arranged through the county. A nurse stopped by twice a week, and a homemaid helped with groceries and light cleaning. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was a safer one. Linda had started counseling as part of the court requirements tied to her case. At first she talked about it like an inconvenience. Over time something shifted. She began listening more, interrupting less. It wasn't a transformation overnight. Real change rarely is. But the edge she once carried had softened. We spoke on the phone every couple of weeks now. Short conversations, careful ones, the kind that build trust slowly instead of assuming it. One afternoon in December, about 11 months after the night on the porch, I received another call. This time it was Mom. Her voice sounded stronger than it had in months. "Evelyn," she said, "are you warm where you are?" I smiled. "Yes, Mom, very warm." "I've been watching the weather," she said. "They say it's going to snow tonight." I heard that too. There was a pause. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "I keep thinking about that night." The words were quiet but heavy. "I do too," I admitted. "I was wrong," she said. "No excuses. No explanations. Just those 3 words. I should have opened the door," she continued. "I should have stopped it immediately. Instead, I laughed." My chest tightened slightly. "I'm sorry." There was a long silence between us. Finally, I said, "Thank you for saying that." It didn't erase what happened. Nothing ever could. But hearing the truth spoken aloud mattered. Later that evening, snow began falling outside my apartment windows. Big slow flakes drifting down through the streetlights. I made myself a cup of tea and wrapped the crocheted blanket around my shoulders. The radiator hummed gently in the corner, filling the room with steady warmth. For a moment, I just watched the snow. It's strange how the same season that once held your worst memory can also hold a kind of peace. That winter night a year earlier had nearly ended my life. But it had also ended something else. The long habit of pretending cruelty was normal simply because it came from family. The truth is, many people my age were raised to believe that loyalty means enduring anything from the people we love. But I learned something different. Real love doesn't leave someone outside in the cold. Real love doesn't laugh while someone suffers. And real forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the harm never happened. It means telling the truth about it, setting boundaries, and deciding what kind of life you want to live afterward. For me, that life turned out to be quieter than I expected. Warmer too. Mom still lives in the same house, but she's no longer alone there. Linda checks in regularly now, and the home care workers make sure things run safely. When I visit, it's for an hour or 2 at a time, never overnight. We drink tea talk about small things and keep the conversations honest. Our relationship will probably never look like it once did. But maybe that's not a loss. Maybe it's simply the shape truth takes after everything has been said. Before going to bed that night, I stepped onto my apartment balcony for just a moment. The air was cold, but not unbearable. Snow covered the parking lot in a quiet white blanket. I looked out across the lights of the complex and felt something simple and steady inside my chest. Gratitude for survival, for peace, for the second chance to live a life that finally belonged to me. And if you're listening to my story right now, maybe there's something in it that speaks to your own life too. Maybe you've spent years carrying hurt you thought you had to endure because that's just family. Maybe you've been the dependable one, the quiet one, the one who absorbs things so others don't have to. If that's you, I hope this story reminds you of something important. Your safety matters. Your dignity matters. And it is never too late to step out of the cold and choose a warmer life. If this story moved, you share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet strength that carries us through life's hardest winters, consider subscribing and joining this community. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us we're not alone. And sometimes surviving the cold is exactly what teaches us how to live.